We've heard it many times. Truth is stranger than fiction. But when trying to keep some semblance of normalcy and sanity in a world that continues to show us its more mysterious side, it might do us well to consider that truth includes a broad spectrum of experience, including possible interactions with human-looking extraterrestrials. Preeminent UFO researcher and historian Richard Dolan, whose painstaking research has culminated into several books, including UFOs and the National Security State Volumes 1 and 2 and AD, After Disclosure, took the time to depart from his usual fare and discuss some of the more perplexing and bizarre aspects of the UFO story. Except none of these incidents involve UFOs per se, but rather ET encounters of the humankind. Take a listen. All right, Richard, it is story time. But the stories that you're about to tell are not your grandmother's stories. These are not the usual fare. These are extraordinary accounts that you've agreed to share with our audience, and I'm grateful for that. And I'm calling this ET Encounters of the Humankind. You know, you've set a precedent, many know, for your impeccable research into the government's possible long-standing cover-up of the UFO ET phenomenon. And you've consistently called the act of disclosure, I love this, the great paradox. Impossible, but inevitable. Where I certainly want to spend a little bit of time before we close out discussing this part of your work. Today, I'd really like to focus on some of the stories that you've become aware of or have been told directly by the witnesses, the experiencers themselves, of human-looking beings who seem to be not so human. So, welcome, Richard.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Alexis. And wow, I really appreciated hearing you talk about my work and from an outsider's perspective. I'm very grateful for that, and I will say that it is very important for me to do all of my work in as careful and meticulous a way as I can. My primary research, that of working with historical documents pertaining to UFOs, remains very, very important to me, and especially in a field where there's so much controversy and so much debate and obfuscation. I've always felt it's essential for us to have a firm foundation of facts that we can rely on. And for that reason, yes, it's very important for me to be able to work off of proven documents and the like in order to construct a narrative of the UFO phenomenon. Having said that, as you're referring to, over the years, over many years now, I've had conversations with individuals who have spoken to me about some very bizarre encounters that they've had in their life. Mm-hmm. This is a different type of evidence than, say, going into an archive and pulling out a Defense Intelligence Agency document that talks about a UFO encounter. These are stories that people have. The thing is that what I've discovered is that there are many, many stories that are, I think, floating around our society that lots of people have about bizarre encounters that they've had in their life. In the cases of stories that have come to me, there's a certain consistency that a number of them have had, and that is encounters by individuals with people who look totally human, mm-hmm. but have aspects about them that are not quite normal and that kind of seem almost superhuman, we might say, and not in a way that makes us feel at ease or happy to run into these people, incidentally. Several of the stories that have come to me concern a blonde male-female couple that looks basically like Scandinavian supermodels in places, but these are individuals who all seem to be very intensely telepathic. And I'll tell a couple of these stories.
Please.
The first such story that I encountered along these lines, I heard from a retired United States Air Force colonel with a PhD back in 2008 when he told this to me. I was in Las Vegas at an event. And this guy was someone who I was introduced to at that conference as someone who was kind of important for my research. Turns out he was important. He had had his own very, very long history of UFO knowledge while in the Air Force back in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. He had done some classified work on the B-2 stealth bomber, which he would not talk to me about. That was the one thing he would not get into. Mm-hmm. Had a long-standing knowledge and interest in the UFO phenomenon through his years in the Air Force, which was well known to his colleagues. And I have to say, on a personal basis, when I chatted with him, it was very engaging, it struck me as a very genuine man. I interviewed him and his wife at this particular event that I was at. And he said to me, after we talked about a number of other things that he'd learned while in the military about UFOs, and we can actually talk about that too. But then he told me this bizarre personal story. He said, and actually, this is like the strangest thing that's ever happened to me, like ever. And I said, well, what is it? And he said, well, I was with my wife, and she nodded, and she said, yeah, we were, and with another friend of ours, a woman, at a Las Vegas casino. And we were just on some downtime, having fun. And he said we were on the second floor of this particular casino, and our mutual friend, the woman who he said was kind of like psychic, that's how he described her. And this is a man who is very open to the paranormal, very open to psychic phenomena. Despite being an Air Force colonel, you might think, they're not. Well, he was. And as I said, he was a PhD as well. He said, anyway, we're walking along the second floor, and my psychic friend grabbed me by the upper arm and stopped me. And she looked over in the direction of this strikingly beautiful blonde woman with this incredible blue outfit on. And she said, she's not like us. She's not one of us. Or something to that effect, she said to him. Now, I'm thinking, well, it's Las Vegas, and you get beautiful women in striking clothing wherever you go. And he said, yes, I realize that. He said, but this woman was different somehow. And the friend and his wife both got nervous, and they both went down the escalator to get away from this beautiful woman who's standing probably 30, 40 feet away, just by herself. So they went down the escalator, and he's still standing there looking at this woman, and her back is partly toward him. And then he said to me, that's when I heard her in my mind. And the thought that I heard coming from her was something like what you'd get from a police officer on the beat, like, nothing to see here, keep it moving. She said something like, there's nothing here for you, just keep moving along, go about your business. That was like this very powerful thought that came into his mind. And he was rather startled by this, as you might think. Moments later, she's joined by an equally beautiful blonde man wearing similarly beautiful blue clothing, like very striking. They're conversing together. He said they're obviously a couple. And after a few minutes, they started walking toward the escalator where he was standing. And he thought, good. When they come here, I'm going to talk to them. I'm going to say something to them. And he steels himself up for this moment. And instead of talking to them, though, they walk right by him. They go on the escalator, and they start going down the escalator. So he thinks, damn it, I wanted to talk to them. He said, well, I'm going to get behind them. So he gets behind them on the escalator as they're all going down this escalator. At this point, his wife interjected in the story, and she said, she was actually really funny. She was sweet. She said, oh, my God, we were so scared. My friend and I were peeking from behind the slot machine out. Yes, right. Looking at this couple coming down the escalator.
Oh, wow.
And him following. And then he continues, and he says, and as I'm going behind them on the escalator, I heard them thinking to each other. And the conversation was something like, yes, he hears us. Yeah, he's no big deal. Ignore him. He's not part of any program. We'll just do what we're doing, essentially. They get to the bottom of the escalator, and they just walk off, and that's the last anyone sees of them. So the aftermath of this is about as interesting as the encounter. So the aftermath of it was the three of these people are conversing. And it turns out the psychic friend of theirs was also a hypnotherapist. And they essentially come to the conclusion that she was going to regress as colonel so that he could more properly remember exact things that might have been thought, by this couple. And he's thinking, that's a good idea. So a couple of days later, like 2 days later, I believe, he's at her house, and this is in Eastern California, near Nevada, but not in Nevada. And she's in this cul-de-sac neighborhood, dead-end neighborhood, very quiet. So he's in her house, lying down on a couch, about to be regressed, And as he's about to be regressed, they start hearing construction sounds outside the house, like jackhammers and construction machinery and the like. They go outside and they find nothing. They go back inside to do the regression again, and once again the noise outside disrupts them. And this happens several times, so much so that they decide, well, obviously we can't do the regression today. He says, but here's the good thing. Look, I'm going to be back in town in about a month, so how about I call you before I arrive, and we can do it then. She says, great, sounds good. So a month goes by. A day or two before he was about to meet her, he calls her on the phone and says, hey, I'm going to be in town. How about, are you still up for that regression? And she says, what do you mean, regression? He says, well, we tried to do that regression last month. Don't you remember? She says, what? Regression? This woman had no memory of anything.
Yeah.
She had no memory of doing the regression. She had no memory of the encounter with the blonde couple. None of that. It was like it did not happen.
Wow.
And they never followed up. So that's a very unsettling story. So the implication clearly is that whoever was behind that encounter with those individuals, whoever they were, some agency did not want this regression to happen, and they were presumably trying to protect something. They wanted to stop it.
Yeah.
Now, 2 years after I got a story from this colonel, I was at a different conference in western Pennsylvania, so on really the other side of the country. This was in 2010. It was right after my book AD After Disclosure came out, and I remember it very well. It was the first time I had those books at an event. And I'm sitting at my table, and this woman and her husband come up to my table. And this woman was about 60 years old at the time. She looked like a nice housewife, honestly. And her husband looked like a nice regular guy who, I don't know what his job was, but they were just good people. You'd probably be happy to have them as your neighbor. Mm-hmm. She said, well, I had a really strange thing happen to me back in 1965, and I'm wondering if I could tell you about it. And I said, yes, of course. I mean, this happens to me all the time when I'm at a conference. People tell me these strange things. So she said, well, it was 1965. I was about 15 years old, and I was in church with my mother here in western Pennsylvania in a tiny little town, and there's lots of tiny little towns in western PA. I've been there many times. She said, where everyone in town knew everybody else, especially in church. So she's with her mother in church. And she sits down in the pew, and right in front of her, this absolutely beautiful blonde couple sits in front of her. And she said, you have to understand, these people were not just attractive. They were like beyond attractive. They were like the most unbelievable supermodels you could imagine. And she said, and their clothing was the most impeccable, fine blue fabric I've ever seen in my whole life.
Here we go with blue again.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Wow.
And being a teenage girl, she didn't say this, but I assume I have a teenage girl, very knowledgeable about fashion, very interested in that sort of thing. So I think she was just transfixed by this couple, like staring at them. And she said, and what amazed me was how like nobody else was looking at these people. It's as if they were just in there, and they were the most obvious thing in this whole church was this blue couple, this blue-dressed blonde couple that looked amazing. And why was I the only one noticing them? I didn't get that. So while she's saying, and she's watching them too, and like they obviously did not fit in. Like they didn't. It was a Catholic mass, and I grew up going to Catholic mass, and you have to sit, kneel, you gesticulate, you do the sign of the cross, you do all of these things. And she said, like, I could tell they didn't know how to do it. Like they were looking around at everyone else and following along. This was like not something that they had grown up doing. Mm-hmm. And she said, as I was thinking this, I heard one of them thinking to the other. So again, and this is on the other side of the country, this woman had no idea who the colonel was. Not a chance. She said, I heard them thinking to each other, and I heard one of them think to the other, well, it appears that we're fitting in pretty well here. Or thoughts to that effect. And then she heard the other one thinking back, yes, except for the girl behind us who can hear us. This is exactly what she told me. Yeah. And at that point, her eyes got very large, and she was scared, obviously, but she was also really intrigued. After that, she heard nothing coming out of their minds. So my sense is that they somehow figured out how to shut it
How
down.
to shut it down, right.
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 They go through the rest of the church service, and they're sitting kind of in the middle of this church. And at the end of the service, this couple gets up and out really fast, like very efficiently. They're just out. And she gets it in her head that she's going to follow them. And she bolts out. And her mother, who was totally oblivious to the whole thing, as all parents typically are, she says, get back here, young lady. Where do you think you're going? But anyway, so she follows them out. So she goes to the front of the church, and she sees them, and they're across this parking lot, and they're going quickly toward like over this little hill, and she trots across there as fast as she can, and then she sees them. They're going across this field toward like a wooded area, and she starts down the hill, and then she stops.